The intensity of the storm had shaken the eastern border regions for 3 consecutive days, leaving a trail of devastation that would be remembered for generations. Thunder rolled across the sky like ancient drums beating their eternal rhythm, each crash reverberating through the valleys and hills with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The Sariba River, normally a gentle ribbon of life flowing through the landscape, had transformed into a monstrous entity of unprecedented fury. Its waters, swollen beyond all recognition, churned and roared with the voice of 1,000 demons. This river, which in peaceful times was considered a symbol of life and prosperity, where children played on its banks, where women drew water for their families, where fishermen cast their nets with hope, had now become a terrifying force of destruction that respected neither age nor innocence. The transformation was complete and merciless. Century-old baobab trees, those ancient sentinels that had witnessed the birth and death of countless generations, were uprooted like mere saplings and swept away. Their massive trunks, some as wide as small houses, tumbled helplessly in the torrential current like broken toys in a child's bath. The sight was both magnificent and heartbreaking. These giants that had provided shade for countless travelers, that had served as meeting points for lovers, that had sheltered entire families during the dry season, were now nothing more than debris in nature's fury. Boulders that had stood firm for millennia, worn smooth by countless seasons of sun and rain, were dislodged from their eternal resting places and disappeared into the churning waters with thunderous crashes that could be heard miles away. The sound echoed off the surrounding hills like the drums of war, each crash marking the erasure of another landmark that had guided travelers for countless generations. Layers of rich, red earth shifted so dramatically that the entire landscape appeared transformed beyond recognition. Fields that had fed families for generations were carved away in minutes, leaving behind raw wounds in the earth that bled muddy water. Roads that had connected communities for decades simply vanished, swallowed by the hungry river as if they had never existed. Ancient burial grounds, sacred groves, and traditional meeting places, all were consumed by the relentless waters. The village elders, their weathered faces marked by decades of reading nature's signs, attributed this catastrophe to supernatural forces beyond human understanding. They spoke in hushed tones of angry spirits and broken taboos, their voices carrying the weight of ancestral wisdom passed down through countless generations. With urgent determination, they guided their people to higher ground, their walking sticks tapping against stone as they led. Processions of families carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. Women balanced bundles on their heads while clutching crying infants to their breasts. Men shouldered the elderly and the weak, their faces grim with the responsibility of protecting their families. Children, wide-eyed with confusion and fear, clung to their parents' robes, their small feet stumbling over the rough terrain as they climbed toward safety. From these elevated positions, the displaced villagers could only watch in stunned silence as the waters below continued their rampage. Houses that had sheltered families for generations crumbled like sandcastles, their mud brick walls no match for the river's fury. Cooking pots floated past like lost memories, and precious family heirlooms disappeared beneath the muddy surface, carrying with them the stories and histories of entire lineages. Children peered through the windows of their temporary mud brick shelters on the hillsides, watching the spectacle with that mixture of terror and fascination that only the young can possess. Their dark eyes, usually bright with mischief and laughter, now reflected the orange flames of the fires their families had built for warmth and comfort. They whispered among themselves, their voices barely audible above the constant roar of the waters below, creating their own explanations for the devastation they witnessed. Some claimed they could see faces in the churning waters, spirits of ancestors warning them of greater disasters to come. Others insisted they heard voices calling from the depths, the cries of the river spirits demanding appeasement. The adults, overwhelmed by their own fears and the immediate need for survival, paid little attention to these childhood fantasies, not realizing that in their innocence, the children might be closer to understanding the spiritual significance of what they were witnessing. Even the most seasoned hunters, men whose very survival depended on their intimate knowledge of the wild, who had faced charging elephants without flinching and wrestled crocodiles with their bare hands, dared not approach the water's edge during those tumultuous days. These warriors of the wilderness, whose courage was legendary throughout the region, stood at safe distances, their hunting spears useless against this liquid enemy that respected neither skill nor bravery. Amadou, the most famous hunter in 3 villages, a man who had single-handedly killed a rogue lion that had terrorized the region, found himself humbled by the river's power. He stood on a rocky outcrop, his weathered hands gripping his spear, not in preparation for attack, but for balance, as he watched the waters below with a mixture of awe and defeat. His hunting dogs, usually eager for any adventure, cowered behind him, their instincts warning them away from this unnatural force. The air itself seemed different during those 3 days, thick with moisture and electricity, carrying sense of destruction and upheaval. The usual sounds of the African wilderness, the calls of birds, the chatter of monkeys, the distant roar of lions, were completely overwhelmed by the constant thunder of the raging waters. It was as if nature itself had gone silent in the face of this elemental fury, leaving only the voice of the river to fill the world with its terrible song. On the 4th morning, as the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern horizon in shades of gold and crimson, the clouds finally began to part. The constant drumbeat of rain that had accompanied the storm started to ease, falling from a torrential downpour to a steady shower, then to occasional drops that caught the early morning light like scattered diamonds. The first tentative rays of sunlight touched the devastated earth, revealing the full extent of the catastrophe in heartbreaking detail. It was in this moment of relative calm, as nature seemed to pause and survey its own handiwork, that President Ibrahim Traoré arrived at the scene. He came neither with his usual convoy of black vehicles with tinted windows, nor surrounded by his typical security detail of stone-faced men in dark suits speaking into hidden microphones. There were no flags flying, no sirens announcing his presence, no advance teams securing the area. Instead, he arrived alone, a decision that would prove more significant than anyone could have imagined. A choice that would echo through history and transform not just his own legacy, but the very understanding of what it means to lead with both courage and compassion. Ibrahim's arrival was as understated as it was unprecedented. His simple 4-wheel drive vehicle, covered in the same red dust that coated everything else in the region, looked no different from those of local farmers or aid workers. There was no presidential seal, no special license plates, nothing to distinguish it from the dozens of other vehicles that had brought curious onlookers and relief workers to witness the aftermath of the storm. As he stepped out of the driver's seat, he had driven himself, another break from protocol that would have given his security chief nightmares. Ibrahim's footsteps immediately began sinking deep into the mud with each step. The earth, saturated beyond its capacity to hold water, yielded beneath his weight like a living thing, trying to pull him down into its embrace. But he pressed forward with quiet determination, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the treacherous terrain. The morning air was thick with humidity and the complex sense of destruction and renewal that follow. Great floods, the earthy smell of displaced soil, the green scent of uprooted vegetation, and underneath it all, the clean smell of fresh water that spoke of new beginnings even in the midst of devastation. With each breath, Ibrahim was taking in not just air, but the very essence of his country's struggle and resilience. He wore no military uniform with its crisp lines and intimidating insignia, no ceremonial attire that might distinguish him from any other citizen concerned about their homeland. There were no medals catching the morning light, no sash of office, no symbols of rank or authority. Instead, he was dressed in a simple olive-green shirt that had seen better days, its fabric soft from countless washings and bearing the faint stains of previous adventures in the field. The shirt was still damp from the morning mist that clung to everything in the aftermath of the storm, and it clung to his lean frame in a way that made him look more like a local farmer than a head of state. His boots were sturdy and practical, the same ones he wore during his frequent, unannounced visits throughout the countryside. They were scuffed and worn, bearing the marks of countless miles walked on difficult terrain, through villages where paved roads were still a dream, across fields where the real work of the nation was done by calloused hands and determined hearts. These boots had carried him through refugee camps where he listened to stories of loss and hope, through schools where children's eyes lit up when they realized their president had come to visit them, through hospitals where he held the hands of the sick and promised better days ahead. This was his way. And those who knew him well understood that Ibrahim Traoré believed in understanding his nation not through reports and statistics delivered in air-conditioned conference rooms by nervous bureaucrats, but through his own eyes and feet, through direct contact with the land and its people. He had learned early in his presidency that the view from the capital was often distorted, filtered through layers of bureaucracy and political convenience until the reality of ordinary citizens' lives became almost unrecognizable, while his ministers presented him with carefully prepared graphs and charts showing economic indicators and development metrics. Ibrahim knew that ground reality was often vastly different from what appeared on paper. Numbers could lie, statistics could be manipulated, and reports could be sanitized to tell whatever story the presenter wanted to tell. But the earth beneath his feet, the expressions on people's faces, the condition of their homes and fields, these things could not be faked or manipulated. Therefore, he frequently embarked on these sudden, quiet journeys throughout his country, leaving behind the comfort and security of the presidential palace to witness his land, his people, and his nation up close, without any pretense or performance. His staff had long since given up trying to talk him out of these excursions, understanding that they were not mere publicity stunts but genuine attempts by their leader to stay connected to the reality of the lives he had sworn to serve and protect, far from the marble halls of power in the capital, with their echoing corridors and formal protocols. There were no cameras here to document his presence, no journalists with their probing questions and flash photography to turn his visit into a media event. The usual apparatus of presidential visits, the advanced teams, the security sweeps, the carefully controlled photo opportunities, was entirely absent. This was not a scheduled stop on an official tour. This was a man responding to his own need to understand and to witness. This was the solitude in which he truly felt the pulse of his country, where he could strip away the layers of ceremony and politics that inevitably surrounded him and simply exist as a citizen among citizens, a human being confronted by the same forces of nature that affected everyone else. In these moments, he wasn't President Traoré with all the weight and responsibility that title carried. He was simply Ibrahim, a son of Africa trying to understand his place in the world. Standing by the river's edge, his feet planted firmly in the muddy bank despite its instability, he gazed silently at the flowing water that continued to carry debris from its violent rampage. The Sariba, still swollen and angry, though no longer at its peak fury, moved past him with hypnotic power. Each drop seemed to whisper stories of the centuries-old suffering and struggle that defined this region, tales of droughts that had driven families from their homes, of floods that had destroyed entire communities, of the eternal cycle of destruction and renewal that had shaped the lives of countless generations. The water was still muddy, thick with the red earth it had torn from the banks and fields upstream. Broken branches and pieces of destroyed homes floated past, like memories being carried away to the sea. Occasionally, something that had once been precious to someone, a child's toy, a cooking pot, a piece of carved wood from a family shrine, would bob to the surface before disappearing again beneath the churning water. It was in this moment of deep contemplation, as Ibrahim stood witness to both the power of nature and the resilience of his people, that an unexpected sound captured his attention. It was not a human voice calling for help or the creaking of damaged structures, but something else entirely, a weak, plaintive cry that seemed to come from the very heart of the devastation. The sound was so faint that at first he thought he might have imagined it, but as he stood perfectly still and listened with the intensity of a hunter, it came again. This was not a human voice, but neither was it the cry of any animal he immediately recognized. It was something that could only be understood by the heart, a sound that pierced through all the noise of rushing water and settling debris and reached directly into the soul. It was the cry of absolute vulnerability, of a creature facing death and calling out to a universe that seemed determined to ignore its plea. Ibrahim was startled. His eyes immediately turned toward the area where the river's erosion was most severe. There before him was a scene that would grip his heart and change the course of history. Ibrahim was startled by the unexpected sound, his years of military training immediately heightening his senses and focusing his attention. His eyes, trained by countless hours in the field to notice details that others might miss, immediately turned toward the area where the river's erosion was most severe. The bank here had been carved away by the floodwaters with surgical precision, leaving raw wounds in the earth that revealed layers of soil and rock that hadn't seen daylight for decades. There, in a scene that would grip his heart and change not only his own destiny, but the course of history itself, was a sight that made him forget for a moment that he was the leader of a nation. A tiny lion cub, its size suggesting it could be no more than 4 months old, was clinging desperately to the half-submerged roots of what had once been a mighty tree. The ancient giant had been one of the casualties of the storm, its massive trunk torn away by the floodwaters, leaving only these gnarled roots as a final refuge for any creature unfortunate enough to need them. The cub's golden-brown fur, which should have been the warm color of African sunlight, was now soaked and matted against its small body, making it appear even tinier and more vulnerable than it actually was. The beautiful coat that would one day mark it as royalty among the beasts was now dark with river water and mud clinging to its thin frame like a shroud. Its large amber eyes, which should have sparkled with the curiosity and playfulness of youth, were instead wide with terror, the kind of primal fear that comes when death approaches and there is nowhere left to run. The cub's small paws, still soft and lacking the hardened pads that would develop with age, were continuously slipping as it tried desperately to maintain its grip on the slippery wood. Each time it managed to get a better hold, the current would surge and threaten to tear it away, forcing the tiny creature to readjust its grip with movements that spoke of exhaustion and growing desperation. Its claws, still small and sharp, left tiny scratches in the bark as it fought for purchase against the relentless force of the water. The river's roar was merciless, a constant thunder that seemed to mock the cub's feeble attempts at survival. The water rushed past with hypnotic power, carrying with it the debris of destruction, broken branches, chunks of red earth, pieces of human habitation, all moving with such force that anything caught in the current would be swept away in seconds. Yet somehow, this tiny creature had managed to find this precarious refuge and was clinging to life with a determination that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. But even as Ibrahim watched, transfixed by the scene before him, the cub's weak cries continued to reach his ears, cutting through the noise of the rushing water with their plaintive desperation. Each cry seemed to contain entire lifetimes of longing, for its mother's warmth, for the safety of the pride, for solid ground beneath its feet, instead of this terrifying liquid chaos that threatened to consume everything. The ground beneath the cub was rapidly eroding, undermined by the constant flow of water that carved away new channels with each passing moment. Ibrahim could see that the roots the cub clung to were already loosened, their grip on the bank weakening as the earth around them was washed away grain by grain. The tree's anchor in the soil, which had held firm through decades of storms and floods, was finally failing under this unprecedented assault. Roots were breaking away one by one, each failure marked by a small splash as another piece of the cub's refuge disappeared into the churning waters. With each passing moment, death crept closer to the innocent creature, and Ibrahim realized with growing urgency that he was witnessing a countdown, a race between his own ability to act and the river's determination to claim another victim. The sight of such vulnerability in the face of overwhelming natural force created a profound moment of reckoning for the president. Here was a situation that could not be resolved through diplomacy, economic policy, or military strategy. Here was a moment that stripped away all the complexity of governance and reduced everything to its most basic element. Would he, Ibrahim Traoré, act to save a life that hung in the balance? The cub, sensing perhaps that it was no longer alone in its struggle, turned its small head toward the shore and looked directly at Ibrahim. Their eyes met across the gap of churning water, the leader of 30 million people and a tiny creature that possessed nothing but the will to live. In that gaze, Ibrahim saw something that would haunt him forever if he failed to act: complete trust. The cub seemed to recognize that here, finally, was someone who might help. Someone who possessed the power to change the outcome of this desperate struggle. But with that recognition came an enormous weight of responsibility. Ibrahim faced a momentous decision that no amount of presidential training or political experience had prepared him for. The rational part of his mind, the part that had been shaped by years of leadership responsibilities, immediately began calculating the risks and consequences of any action he might take. Could he, as a president, risk his own life? His security advisors had drilled into him countless times that he was no longer just a private citizen who could make impulsive decisions based on personal feelings. He was the head of state, and his life belonged not just to himself but to the 30 million people who looked to him for leadership and stability. Any unnecessary risk he took could potentially leave the nation leaderless at a critical time, could destabilize the government, could even plunge the country into chaos. Or could he, as a human being, stand by silently and watch while a helpless creature died before his eyes? Could he return to his palace, knowing that he had chosen personal safety over compassion, that he had failed the most basic test of humanity when faced with suffering he had the power to alleviate? The internal struggle was intense but brief. In that critical moment, his mother's words echoed in his memory with startling clarity, as if she were standing beside him on the muddy bank. "Son, a true leader is one who stands up even when no one is watching, who does what is right, not because it will be rewarded or recognized, but because it is simply right." These words, spoken to him decades earlier when he was just a young man finding his way in the world, now returned to guide him at the most crucial moment of his presidency. They reminded him that leadership was not about the trappings of power or the privileges of office, but about the fundamental willingness to serve others, even at great personal cost. Ibrahim stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity, but was in reality only a few precious seconds, time that the drowning cub could not afford to lose. The thundering waves of the Siriba River continued their relentless assault on the weakening bank, each surge threatening to undermine the ground beneath his own feet. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar that seemed to fill not just his ears, but his entire being, making it difficult to think clearly about anything except the immediate crisis unfolding before him. Before him, the lion cub held onto the wood with what appeared to be its very last remaining strength. Ibrahim could see the exhaustion in every line of its small body, the way its shoulders trembled with the effort of maintaining its grip, the way its head barely stayed above the water level, the increasingly desperate quality of its cries for help. With each passing second, its voice grew fainter and more strained, as if life itself was slowly ebbing from its tiny body like air from a punctured balloon. The president's mind was suddenly flooded with all the warnings his advisors had repeatedly given him over the years, their voices now seeming to speak in unison inside his head. "Mr. President, your life is no longer just your own. You are not a private citizen who can afford to make impulsive decisions based on emotion or personal feelings. Your safety represents the protection of 30 million people's dreams and future, their hopes for stability and progress. Any unnecessary risk you take could endanger not just yourself, but the entire nation. Your death could destabilize the government, could throw the country into political chaos, could undo years of careful progress and development." The rational arguments were compelling and familiar. He had heard them countless times in security briefings and strategy sessions. His protection detail had made it clear that every moment of his life was now a calculated risk, that every decision he made had to be weighed against its potential impact on national security and political stability. The presidency, they reminded him, was bigger than any individual, even the individual who held the office. This was the harsh reality of leadership at the highest level. His life was no longer solely his own to risk or preserve. Every choice he made rippled outward to affect millions of people who looked to him for guidance and stability. One decision made in a moment of crisis could potentially alter the destiny of an entire nation. The weight of that responsibility had been drilled into him from the moment he took office, a constant reminder that he was now more than just Ibrahim Traoré. He was the embodiment of his people's hopes and fears. But then, cutting through the chorus of caution and political calculation, another voice emerged from within him, older, deeper, and infinitely more personal. It was the voice of his childhood, the voice of his mother during those formative years when she had shaped not just his understanding of right and wrong, but his very conception of what it meant to be a leader among his people. Ibrahim. Her voice seemed to whisper across the years, as clear as if she were standing beside him on the muddy riverbank. A true leader is one who sacrifices first and benefits last, who puts the welfare of others before his own comfort and safety, who understands that real power comes not from what you can take, but from what you are willing to give. These words, spoken to him decades earlier but preserved in his heart like precious gems, now returned to challenge every argument for caution and self-preservation. They reminded him that his mother had raised him not to be a politician who calculated every move based on its political advantage, but to be a man who understood that some moments in life transcend all practical considerations and demand nothing less than complete moral commitment. The internal struggle was intense, a battle between the trained instincts of a responsible leader and the deeper calling of fundamental human decency. His advisors' voices represented everything he had learned about the practical realities of governance, the need for stability, the importance of institutional continuity, the responsibility to preserve himself for the greater good of the nation. But his mother's voice represented something even more fundamental, the values that had brought him to leadership in the first place, the moral foundation that made him worthy of the trust his people had placed in him. She had taught him that leadership was not primarily about holding office or wielding power, but about the willingness to stand up for what is right even when it is difficult, dangerous, or politically inconvenient. The decision, when it finally crystallized in his mind, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitable conclusion. He knew that this moment was the ultimate test of everything he claimed to believe about leadership and service. It would determine whether he was merely a president, a holder of office who made calculated decisions based on political expediency, or something far more valuable, a human being whom history would remember not for his titles or achievements, but for his willingness to risk everything for a single act of compassion. Just as this realization reached its full intensity, the moment of decision was thrust upon him with dramatic finality. A loud crack echoed across the water, cutting through even the constant roar of the river. The sound was sharp and definitive, like a gunshot or the snapping of a massive bone. Ibrahim's eyes immediately fixed on its source, and what he saw sent a chill of urgency through his entire body. The root that the cub had been clinging to with such desperate determination, its final lifeline in a world of churning chaos, suddenly broke away from the weakened bank. The piece of wood that had been the difference between life and death for the tiny creature simply gave up its long battle against the flood's relentless assault. With a splash that seemed to echo with finality, the cub disappeared from sight, swallowed by the muddy waters that showed no mercy for size, age, or innocence. One moment it had been there, its golden eyes wide with terror, but still reflecting the will to live. The next moment, there was nothing but empty water and the terrible knowledge that a life was slipping away with each passing second. In that instant, time seemed to stop completely. The world around Ibrahim became perfectly still and silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath to see what he would do. The constant roar of the river faded to a whisper, the morning birdsong disappeared, and even the wind seemed to pause in anticipation of his decision. Ibrahim faced the moment that would define not just his presidency, but his very identity as a human being. He could choose safety, rationality, and political prudence, remain on solid ground, and later explain to his conscience and his people that he had responsibilities greater than any single life, that leaders sometimes had to make hard choices that prioritized the greater good over individual compassion, or he could choose something else entirely. He could forget everything about political calculations and presidential responsibilities and become simply a human being who saw another creature in mortal danger and could not stand by while it died. Suddenly, his body moved of its own accord. The leather bag containing important state documents fell from his hands to the ground. His boots sank into the mud, but he ran with all his strength to the water's edge and leaped into the river with a powerful jump. The water gripped his body like an enemy attacking him. The first moment was nearly fatal. Ice-cold water began to fill his lungs. The powerful current started dragging his body as if some beast was pulling him down with its might. Hidden pieces of wood and branches began to wound his arms and face. A heavy log struck his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. But he did not give up. Before his eyes was only one scene, the tiny lion cub drowning with each passing moment. His heart told him, "If I am a president, it means I am the first to stand for the protection of others." He began to fight against the waves, moving his arms with all his strength. The river was constantly pushing him back, but he was not willing to give up even an inch. In this struggle, he suddenly saw a golden flash in the water. The cub was spinning in a small whirlpool, surfacing briefly before disappearing again. A fierce determination ignited in Ibrahim's eyes. "This innocent creature is my responsibility." This single phrase kept repeating in his heart. Ibrahim Traoré's body was burdened with wounds and exhaustion, but the light of determination in his eyes refused to dim. The swift current of the Siriba River was relentlessly attacking him. Each wave pushed his body backward. Every piece of wood and stone became an obstacle in his path. But in his mind was only one image, that tiny lion cub that surfaced helplessly only to sink again. For Ibrahim, this was not just an animal, but a symbol of life, an innocent being that depended entirely on others for its survival. His breathing became rapid. The burning pain in his lungs was increasing as if fire was blazing inside. Every breath was precious to him, but time was running out quickly. The cub could probably survive only a few more moments. Ibrahim gathered all his strength and began swimming against the current with one final surge. His arms were cutting through the waves, his legs were giving continuous thrusts, and his heart was beating violently. Finally, he reached the spot where the golden flash had been visible. Suddenly, his hands touched something soft but trembling. It was the lion cub. Without a moment's hesitation, Ibrahim gripped it firmly with both hands. As soon as his fingers touched the cub's wet fur, the creature used its last strength to dig its claws into Ibrahim's shoulder. The sharp-pointed nails tore through his skin and blood began to flow, but Ibrahim paid no heed. In that moment, there was only one feeling in his heart: life. He pressed the cub against his chest. Its heartbeat was fast and irregular, but it was alive. Ibrahim's heart seemed to offer thanks, but the river's hostility was far from over. Suddenly, a heavy piece of wood struck his back. The pain tried to render him unconscious for a moment, but he gritted his teeth, pulled the cub even closer to his chest, and pushed upward with all his might. The distance to the surface now seemed like centuries to him. When his head broke through the water's surface, he was able to take a long, bitter breath. Coughing, he expelled the water, but his arms still held the cub firmly. He knew he now had to reach the shore. Moving his feet, he felt solid stones beneath him, a harbinger of land. After a few more efforts, he slowly began moving toward the shore. Upon reaching land, his knees gave way. He collapsed in the mud. The cub pressed against his chest, lying there breathless. The lion cub was still trembling, but the soft sound of breathing could be heard from its chest. Tears flowed from Ibrahim's eyes, not tears of weakness, but of gratitude. He had saved a life, even if it meant risking his own. Ibrahim's breathing was labored, waves of pain still coursing through his ribs, but the tiny being cradled in his arms made all the suffering fade away. The lion cub, pressed against his chest, was trembling with its eyes closed, but the steady sound of its breathing was clearly audible. For several moments, they both lay in the mud, silently sharing the space between life and death. Then suddenly the atmosphere changed. Through the river's roar, another sound emerged, deep, rough, and threatening. This sound was coming from a cluster of trees. Ibrahim slowly raised his head, and the scene he witnessed stopped his heart for a moment. 5 lionesses were emerging from the shadows. Sunlight fell upon their bodies, creating a golden shimmer. Their gait possessed that silence and dignity found only in nature's true rulers. Each step fell so softly on the ground that they seemed like shadows, free from the reality of flesh and blood. A semicircle began forming around Ibrahim. The military mind within him immediately began calculating. I am wounded. The river is behind me. There are 6 lions ahead, and in my arms is a cub from their pride. The outcome is clear. But still, no part of his being was prepared to run or scream. He knew that running meant destruction and standing still might mean a miracle. The tiny cub let out a soft whimper from its small mouth. That sound cut through the atmosphere like lightning. A gleam appeared in the eyes of the lioness standing in front. She lowered her head and took 2 steps forward. Now only a few inches separated Ibrahim from the lioness. The lioness's breath could be felt on his face, warm and filled with the distinctive scent of the wild. Ibrahim's eyes met hers. In those eyes was not ferocity, but a question, a wordless dialogue. Is my cub safe? Ibrahim gently lifted the lion cub slightly higher. The cub cried out weakly again, and in the next moment the lioness took an extraordinary step. Instead of roaring, she made a soft, purring sound, the kind lionesses make only when communicating with their young. This moment was against every principle of human history. A president and a predator stood face to face, and only one thing connected them, the feeling of love and protection. Then the impossible happened. The lioness lowered her head and gently touched Ibrahim's forehead with her tongue. This action is typically performed by lions for their cubs. It was a sign of acceptance and respect. Tears filled Ibrahim's eyes. He felt as if centuries-old distances had been bridged in a moment. Upon seeing this scene, the other lionesses also moved forward. One gently rubbed her neck against his shoulder. Another touched his clothing from behind. They were all including him in their family in their own language. Ibrahim knew this was not just gratitude, but a covenant. He had entered the sacred circle of the animal world. Ibrahim had barely caught his breath when another terrifying presence spread through the dense silence of the jungle. A shadow emerged from behind the trees, and moment by moment, that shadow began to transform into a magnificent being. This was a male lion, so splendid and fearsome that it seemed nature had concentrated all its power into this single existence. His black mane flowed in the wind. His shoulders were so broad that the ground seemed to tremble, and in his eyes was that golden light containing centuries of wisdom and wildness. Every movement of the lion created vibrations in the earth. For a moment, Ibrahim felt that all his courage, all his politics, all his military experience had become meaningless. He knew this was the point where human power ends and natural authority begins. But the male lion did not roar, nor did he show his blood-stained fangs. He walked directly toward Ibrahim. His steps were those of a measured walking king who had no need to display his power. His eyes communicated with Ibrahim's eyes, a dialogue free from words. This was the moment when the president and the lion saw each other purely as leaders. Both were leaders in their respective domains. Both carried the responsibility of their families and subjects on their shoulders. As the lion approached, Ibrahim felt an extraordinary peace in his heart. He knew this was the decisive moment. If he showed even a hint of fear or aggression, everything would be ruined. But he strengthened his heart and bowed before the lion. This was not a bow of slavery, but of respect, a salute from one leader to another. Then the impossible happened, erasing the line between nature and humanity. The male lion lowered his head. Yes, the same lion that never bows to anyone. He lowered his mane-covered neck. For 3 heartbeats, he remained bowed. This was a salute, an acknowledgement that Ibrahim's decision to risk his life was true leadership. Tears flowed uncontrollably from Ibrahim's eyes. His hands were trembling, but there was a strange dignity in his heart. He gently placed the lion cub on the ground, who had now fully regained consciousness and began mewing upon recognizing its mother. The lioness stepped forward, sniffed and licked the cub, then took it in her arms. The echo of that moment was so powerful that it seemed the entire jungle was becoming its witness. Now the lionesses and the male lion stood in a semicircle, but this time their manner contained no suspicion or threat. This was an attitude of respect and trust. Ibrahim tried to stand on his tired legs with great effort. His mud-covered body no longer looked like that of a defeated person, but like someone whom the jungle had accepted as one of its own. As soon as the lioness picked up her cub in her mouth, an indescribable peace descended upon the jungle atmosphere. Ibrahim Traoré sat on the ground from exhaustion, but before his eyes was a scene that perhaps occurs once in centuries. The lioness was caressing her cub, sometimes licking it, sometimes humming in soft tones. The cub's weak mewing was now transforming into trust through its mother's touch. But throughout this time, the lioness's eyes remained fixed on Ibrahim. Her gaze seemed to say, "This favor will be remembered." Now, one by one, the other lionesses also expressed their reaction. The first lioness, whose body bore the scars of old wounds, slowly stepped forward and rubbed her head against Ibrahim's side. This was the same action they performed when accepting members of their pride. The second lioness came from behind, and her body's touch passed over the president's back as if she had included him in her circle. The third lioness touched his hand with her nose. All these were behaviors reserved only for pride members, and now they were considering a human as part of their family. Ibrahim's heart trembled involuntarily. He knew that this scene was not in any record of human history. This was not mere gratitude, but seemed like a ritual, a moment in which nature had declared in its own language that this human was no longer an enemy, but an ally. During this time, the lion cub, who was regaining strength with its mother, made a happy sound upon seeing Ibrahim from a few steps away. The lioness looked back at the cub, but then once again at Ibrahim, as if having to acknowledge that the human who saved their family's life was now incomplete without them. Now came the moment that should perhaps be remembered most of all. The male lion, who had been silently and majestically observing everything, stepped forward once again. His footsteps echoed on the ground, but there was neither terror nor anger in his manner. He came straight to Ibrahim and gently placed his massive head against the president's shoulder. This moment was no less than a coronation ceremony in the jungle's court. Ibrahim placed his hands slowly on the lion's mane and felt that this power was not just strength, but trust. He realized that today the jungle had given him a new title, trustworthy. The lionesses stood in the semicircle, while the male lion stepped back and signaled to his group. Now they all stood around Ibrahim slowly. This was no longer an encirclement, but had become a circle of honor. They were seeing the president standing with them, as if their pride was welcoming a new member. Ibrahim slowly bowed his head. There were tears in his eyes, but these were not tears of fear or exhaustion, but of the realization that a new language had been born between humans and nature. The scene was constantly changing before Ibrahim Traoré's eyes. A moment earlier, he had been lying alone in the river's mud, wounded and exhausted, but now lionesses and the male lion stood around him in a new manner. This was no longer an encirclement, but a caravan, a circle of honor where the jungle had declared in its own language that this human was no longer a guest, but a family member. Suddenly, the lioness who had regained her cub made a distinctive sound. This was the same sound the pride makes when going out to hunt or marking their territory. With this sound, the other lionesses began to move. The male lion also slowly started walking, and thus this caravan began moving with President Ibrahim from the jungle's depths toward open ground. Ibrahim slowly rose. His feet were still heavy with exhaustion and wounds, but there was new courage in his heart. He knew this moment would become part of history. He began walking, and with him, the lionesses and male lion began walking like a procession. Their footsteps were silent, but in this silence was such majesty that the entire jungle was holding its breath to witness this scene. Birds sitting on trees fell silent, monkeys froze on their branches, and even a crocodile basking in the sun far on the shore disappeared into the water. It seemed that every living soul in nature had stopped its activities to become a witness to this impossible scene. Mud and blood were flowing from Ibrahim's body, but at that moment, all that burden felt light. The feeling that dominated his heart was that he had become part of a miracle. The lionesses occasionally touched his arm or leg lightly with their bodies as if to reassure him. The male lion was walking on his left side with such dignity as if he were a guardian. This was a scene that was almost impossible to describe in words. For about 20 minutes, this caravan continued walking from the jungle's inner part. Light was filtering through the trees, and every ray was scattering on the ground like golden threads. Ibrahim felt as if he were part of a royal procession. But this royalty was not of humans, but of nature. Finally, an open space appeared in the distance, the same place where Ibrahim's vehicle was parked and his security team was standing anxiously waiting. The soldiers had weapons in their hands and terror written on their faces. But as soon as they saw their president coming with a caravan of lions, their weapons began to drop. This was a scene that neither their minds nor their eyes could believe. Ibrahim's heart realized that this journey was not just one of rescue, but of a message. The jungle had chosen him to show the world that true leadership is that which protects, no matter how old the boundaries of enmity might be. Ibrahim Traoré reached the open field with that jungle procession. As soon as he approached his security personnel, everyone's faces showed the same expression: complete amazement. His soldiers had seen many battles in their lives, fought wars, faced conspiracies, but they had never even dreamed of such a scene. Their president was blood-stained and mud-covered, but walking with dignity among lionesses and a male lion. When the caravan stopped at the edge of the open field, the lions halted and allowed the president to move forward. This was a farewell, a declaration that Ibrahim was being safely returned to his world. The soldiers stood speechless. No one had the courage to speak. Ibrahim paused for a moment and turned to look back toward the jungle. The lions were still standing there in a semicircle like border guards. Then, one by one, they began to disappear silently into the shadows of the trees. The male lion turned away last, but before leaving, he once again saluted Ibrahim with his eyes. This scene might have seemed like part of a movie story, but the reality was that this entire episode had been recorded by drone cameras in the sky. These drones had actually been sent into the air to assess flood damage. Their cameras had become witnesses to the century's most remarkable moment. Within just a few hours, this footage reached experts at the central government in Ouagadougou. From there, this video was sent to international organizations. Animal experts sitting in Paris were stunned upon seeing this video. News agencies in London and New York immediately made it breaking news. With headlines of "The Lion President," Ibrahim Traoré's journey spread across the world. The video began spreading like wildfire on social media. In just 12 hours, this clip was viewed millions of times. Children in Tokyo schools were drawing pictures of the president and lions. Musicians in Brazil began writing songs about this episode. Young people in Africa began considering this story as part of their identity. The same thing was being discussed in every language. Leadership is not that which creates fear through force, but that which creates trust through love. International analysts declared it the beginning of a new political terminology. Leadership in the wild began being written in books about how a president risked his life to protect an innocent, and nature honored him in its kingdom. Religious leaders called it a divine miracle. Scientists considered it the greatest example of interspecies communication, and common people saw it as a ray of hope. But the greatest impact was in Africa's villages and cities. People began sitting around fires telling stories. Children began playing the roles of the president and lions in their games. This was no longer just an incident, but began transforming into a legendary story that would be told for generations. After the fame of the lion president spread worldwide, Ibrahim Traoré's personality was no longer confined to just being the president of one country. He became a symbol of leadership that prioritizes service over power and earns respect through love instead of fear. Every speech of his now included a new dimension. He no longer spoke only of development plans or political statistics, but of respect for nature and the mutual relationship of all creatures. His frequently repeated phrase became, "Power without compassion is tyranny, and authority without humility is oppression." His cabinet meetings also changed. Where previously only roads, electricity, and budget were discussed, now environmental protection, forest conservation, river cleanliness, and wildlife protection gained central importance. Ministers who previously considered these topics trivial now knew that in the president's view, this was the foundation of the country. He clearly stated, "If our land is sick, our nation can never be healthy." On the international level, his words gained new weight. When Ibrahim spoke at the United Nations General Assembly, not only political leaders but also environmental experts and social leaders gathered to hear him speak. He said, "I have learned a lesson among lions. The real foundation of leadership is trust. When a male lion can accept his kingdom's enemy as a brother, why can't we humans accept each other with respect and love?" These words not only drew applause but also brought practical effects in several countries. The African Union included environmental protection in its central agenda for the first time. Neighboring countries like Nigeria and Mali began forest conservation projects. European Union representatives came to meet Ibrahim to incorporate ecological leadership models into their policies. During this time, this story had the greatest impact on the new generation in universities. Students began conducting lion walks instead of protests, peaceful marches where they carried posters of harmony between lions and humans on the streets. Their slogan was, "We want leaders who earn respect, not force it." This new wave forced politicians to also speak about environmental protection and public service in their speeches. Ibrahim's leadership was not confined to Africa alone. Young leaders in Asia, Europe, and America also began following his footsteps. His story began being taught as a case study in business schools. Military academies began presenting this episode as an example that true courage is that which protects the weak. But the greatest change was in his own country. Village children no longer saw lions as enemies but began viewing them as nature's guardians. Elders would sit around fires at night repeating this tale and saying, "This is the president whom the jungle accepted as its brother." Years passed, but the incident at the Siriba River's edge was still alive. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership had given the country a new path, but along with this, another reality emerged. That moment had become such a part of his personal life that he could never forget it. He often wondered whether the lion cub he had lifted in his arms had now grown up. Was it still with its mother? This question repeatedly drew him back to that sacred place. One evening, when the sun was bathing the jungle in golden light, Ibrahim decided to go to the Siriba riverbank alone once again. This time he went not as a president but as a human being. He wore the same olive green shirt that had been lovingly preserved after this incident years ago. Step by step, he walked along the path where he had once fought death and witnessed a miracle. Now the atmosphere was peaceful. The river was flowing clear and transparent as if the storm's wounds had healed. Birds were chirping happily in the trees, and the air carried the sweet scent of moist earth. Ibrahim stopped at the riverbank and began looking around silently. Suddenly, a familiar sound emerged from the bushes, a soft growl that expresses the special relationship of lions. His heart beat fast. A young lion emerged from the tree shadows. It was the same cub, but now grown into a magnificent adult. Its mane was emerging black, its eyes held dignity, and its body showed strength. Without any hesitation, it stepped toward Ibrahim and placed its head against his thigh. The same gesture it had learned from its mother years ago, of trust and recognition. Tears flowed from Ibrahim's eyes. This relationship had not weakened with time, but had grown stronger. After a few moments, the rest of the pride also emerged from the bushes, the lionesses, the same male lion whose majesty was still intact. All slowly approached. This reunion was no less than a miracle. They all sat around Ibrahim as they had years before. The jungle's silence was once again immersed in respect. Ibrahim spent time among them until evening. There was neither fear nor distance. When the sun set and the sky was painted in crimson gold, he realized that this moment was not just a meeting but a covenant that humans and nature can walk together, not as enemies but as companions. This incident later became part of Africa's legends. Elders would sit around fires telling children, and children would listen with dreams in their eyes. The story was no longer just about a president or a lion. It had become a message for an entire generation. True leadership is that which earns trust through love and sacrifice. Thus, the relationship born on the banks of the Sariba became eternal, transcending time, borders, and generations. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and the lions became more than just a tale of rescue. It became a testament to the possibility of understanding between species, the power of compassion over fear, and the truth that real strength lies not in dominance, but in protection of the vulnerable. In classrooms across the world, children learned about the president who jumped into raging waters to save a drowning cub. In boardrooms, executives discussed leadership models based on service rather than command. In military academies, cadets studied the courage that protects rather than conquers. But perhaps most importantly, in the villages along the Sariba River where the story began, the relationship between humans and the wild had fundamentally changed. Farmers spoke of lions with respect rather than fear. Children played games where humans and animals lived in harmony. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the evening light painted the landscape gold, locals reported seeing a figure walking peacefully among the great cats of Africa, a reminder that understanding and compassion can bridge even the widest divides. The lion president had shown the world that true leadership is not about the throne you sit upon, but about the lives you're willing to risk your own to save. In doing so, he had not only rescued a drowning cub, he had demonstrated that the barriers between species, like those between peoples, are not insurmountable when approached with genuine love and courage. And so the legend lived on, passed from generation to generation, a story of a president who became a brother to lions, and in doing so, became a symbol of hope for all humanity. Proof that even in our modern world, miracles can still happen when one person chooses compassion over calculation, courage over comfort, and service over self-preservation. The river still flows, the lions still roam, and somewhere in the space between human ambition and natural wisdom, the spirit of that extraordinary day continues to inspire leaders who understand that true power lies not in what you can take, but in what you are willing to give.